Today's founder is Edmund Pendleton, and Edmund Pendleton is an extremely interesting American founder, mostly because something he was involved in a decade before the American founding, something called the John Robinson scandal. Now, Edmund Pendleton was 45 years old, an attorney general in the 1760s, just as the Stamp Act was getting passed and other acts, including the Currency Act, which is very important to today's discussion. Because while he was 45 years old, his mentor, John Robinson, passes away. And Edmund Pendleton is the one who's chosen to oversee the execution of Robinson's estate. Now, Robinson was an extraordinarily important colonial leader. He was both Speaker of the House of Burgesses, which was Virginia's colonial assembly, and Virginia's treasurer. Now, you probably shouldn't hold both these positions at the same time, and we're about to find out why. You see, John Robinson and the Virginia colonial government in general, after the end of the French and Indian War, well, like most colonies, there was a little bit of a recession because war is very profitable and ending a war isn't so profitable. Especially when now they want to pay all these troops and all the other things Britain was trying to do to raise money. So one of the things Virginia did is it printed a bunch of money to be passed around to help people pay their debts. And then the idea was after it gets passed around, it would be recollected by the treasurer, who would then destroy the money, so that there wouldn't be any inflation. It would inflate for a minute just to keep up with the recession and get through the recession, and then the money would be destroyed and when everything got back to normal. That was the game plan. Unfortunately, Mr. John Robinson, he didn't destroy the money. In fact, he loaned it out because even though the money was being collected, the recession hadn't really ended. And many of the wealthy elites of Virginia, well, they were heavily in debt before the war, and now they were even more in debt. So what did they do? Well, they took out more debt. And they took that debt from John Robinson. No one really realized that the money they were borrowing from John Robinson wasn't John Robinson's money. No. That was the Virginia currency that was supposed to be destroyed. But it wasn't destroyed. It was loaned out. Suddenly, John Robinson dies. Edmund Pendleton comes in and starts reviewing the estate, and he stumbles onto, oh man, he didn't destroy this money. He loaned it out. And suddenly word got out about that, and that essentially collapses Virginia's economy. In the this is 1766. So right after the Stamp Act comes around, right about the time the Stamp Act is getting repealed, but at the same time, there's the Currency Act, which essentially says you guys can't print your own currency, which, knowing this John Robinson story happening simultaneously, actually makes a lot of sense from the British point of view because they didn't want exactly this to be happening. And then the colonists complain about it, and as they're complaining about it, it's happening. So Edmund Pendleton discovers this, but he actually, you would think this would destroy his reputation being associated with John Robinson, but no, he handles it really well, especially as Attorney General of Virginia. And additionally, he starts blaming the British government for putting them in this situation. So it is no surprise to you that a handful of years later, when the American Revolution begins, when the First Continental Congress meets, Edmund Pendleton is sent to the First Continental Congress, and he signs the Articles of Association and the boycott on British imported goods. Now, the next year, Edmund Pendleton actually goes back to the Second Continental Congress, and he does a lot of great things there, but he returns to Virginia, and he doesn't sign the Declaration of Independence. Instead, he becomes president of the Virginia Committee of Safety. And I want to remind you that even after the Declaration of Independence is signed, the founders really thought that the work in their home state was significantly more important than the work in the Continental Congress. It's one of the reasons the Articles of Confederation kind of fail is because no one cares to go to Philadelphia to be a part of the Confederated government. They want to be home in their state governments. And Edmund Pendleton is no different. He leaves before independence, but he's president of the Virginia Committee of Safety, which kind of makes him governor in all but name, and puts him at the head of most of the militias. He also serves as the president of the Virginia Conventions, specifically the 5th Virginia Convention, which issues Richard Henry Lee instructions to declare these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. So again, he's the one who signs the letter to Richard Henry Lee, who then stands up on the floor of the Continental Congress and recommends independence. Furthermore, he works with George Mason, who George Mason really wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which the Bill of Rights for the Constitution would later be based on. But the Virginia Declaration of Rights is Mason really wrote them, but Pendleton advised him while writing that. They were close friends. And again, by this point, Pendleton is one of the older revolutionaries and looked up to by a lot of the founders, especially in Virginia. Pendleton, of course, he serves as the president of the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals. It's not really Chief Justice of Virginia, but it's a high-ranking justice. Court systems are complicated and different in all the revolutionary states, so I'm not going to get too into it, but a very important justice. And then he actually ends up being president of Virginia's ratification convention when the United States Constitution is ratified. And when John Robinson dies at the age of 82, almost in 1803, almost 40 years after John Robinson died, and that whole first scandal happens, almost half of his life later, he is still finding ways to repay the John Robinson estate because his old mentor, John Robinson, had really sank that much of Virginia's wealthy elite into financial crisis that 40 years later, an entire revolution, after George Washington, John Adams, and into Thomas Jefferson's presidency, they are still paying off the debts from the John Robinson estate. So that is an extremely brief overview from one of the most, I'd say, overlooked and underappreciated leaders of revolutionary Virginia. Most of the other head guys, you'll at least passingly recognize the name. I said George Mason, Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry. These are names you've heard at least. Edmund Pendleton, a lot of people have not heard, but Pendleton is certainly one of those leaders. So please hit like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe for more American Revolution content.